The winter rain fell hard on the cobblestone streets of Prague, turning everything gray and cold. Marcus Holloway stood under the awning of the concert hall, checking his watch for the third time in 2 minutes. He was late for his own lecture, but he didn't care. Being the most feared music critic in Europe came with certain privileges, and punctuality wasn't one he bothered to maintain. Inside the grand hall, 200 students waited nervously. They had paid good money to hear Marcus tear apart modern composers and their pathetic attempts at creating something meaningful. He was known for his brutal honesty, his sharp tongue, and his complete unwillingness to praise anything that didn't meet his impossibly high standards. In 20 years of criticism, he had destroyed more careers than he had built, and he wore that reputation like a badge of honor. Marcus finally walked through the heavy wooden doors, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the marble floor. Water dripped from his long black coat, leaving a trail behind him. The students fell silent immediately. Everyone knew his face from the magazines and television appearances. His thin lips, sharp nose, and cold blue eyes had become symbols of everything that was wrong with the classical music establishment, according to some. To others, he was the last guardian of true artistic standards. He took the stage without greeting anyone, without a smile, without even acknowledging that he had kept them waiting. The lecture hall smelled of old wood and nervous sweat. Marcus pulled out his notes and began speaking in his characteristic flat, emotionless voice about the death of real music in the modern age. He spoke of how technology had ruined everything, how young musicians no longer understood discipline, how the masses had become content with mediocrity. For 90 minutes, he lectured without pause, without humor, without warmth. The students scribbled notes frantically, afraid to miss a single word. Some looked inspired. Others looked terrified. A few in the back row looked like they were reconsidering their entire career choice. Marcus didn't notice or care. He had stopped caring about the emotional impact of his words years ago, right around the time his own dreams of becoming a concert pianist had died. When the lecture ended, Marcus gathered his papers and walked off stage without taking questions. He ignored the students who tried to approach him, rushed past the university staff who wanted to thank him, and pushed through the main doors back into the rain. The cold air hit his face, and for a moment, he stood there, feeling nothing at all. This was his life now. Talking about music instead of making it. Destroying instead of creating. It was easier this way, he told himself. Safer. He pulled his coat tight and started walking toward his car. The street was nearly empty at this hour. Most sensible people were home having dinner with their families. Marcus had no family waiting for him. No friends to call. Just an empty apartment filled with books about music he no longer loved and awards for criticism he no longer believed in. But that was fine. He had convinced himself it was fine. As he walked, he heard something strange. Music. Real music. Not coming from a car radio or a shop, but live music, played by human hands on a real instrument. He stopped walking and listened. The sound was coming from an alley between two old buildings. Marcus knew he should keep walking. Street musicians were usually talentless hacks looking for spare change, playing simplified versions of songs everyone had heard 1,000 times. But something about this music made him pause. It wasn't a melody he recognized. It wasn't even played on an instrument he could immediately identify. Against his better judgment, Marcus turned into the alley. The narrow space was darker than the street, lit only by a single flickering lamp mounted on the brick wall. Puddles reflected the weak yellow light. And there, sitting on an overturned wooden crate, was a man playing something that looked like a violin but wasn't quite right. The instrument was old, possibly ancient, with strange carvings along its body. The man himself looked like he had lived 100 lives, all of them hard. His clothes were torn and stained, layered against the cold. His gray hair hung in tangled strands around a face that was weathered and scarred. His hands, though, were different. They moved across the instrument with impossible grace, fingers dancing in patterns that seemed to defy normal human anatomy. He played with his eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music. Marcus stood at the entrance to the alley, frozen. The music was unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't classical, wasn't jazz, wasn't folk or traditional. It existed outside categories, outside time. The melody seemed to shift and change, sometimes sounding ancient as earth itself, sometimes impossibly modern. There were notes that shouldn't work together but somehow did, creating harmonies that made Marcus's chest tighten. For the first time in 15 years, Marcus felt something when he heard music. Not the cold analytical appreciation he had trained himself to feel. Not the bitter satisfaction of finding flaws to criticize. This was something deeper, something he thought he had lost forever. It was the feeling he had as a child when his mother first showed him the piano, when the world seemed full of magic and possibility. The beggar opened his eyes and saw Marcus standing there. For a moment, the music faltered, just slightly. Their eyes met across the dark alley. The beggar's eyes were strange, an unusual shade of amber that seemed to catch the light. They were old eyes, eyes that had seen too much. But they weren't bitter. They held something Marcus couldn't name. Peace, maybe. Or acceptance. Marcus realized he had been holding his breath. He let it out slowly, creating a small cloud in the cold air. The beggar smiled just slightly and kept playing. The moment of recognition passed, and the music continued as if Marcus wasn't there at all. That irritated him somehow. People usually reacted when Marcus Holloway was present. They became nervous or excited or defensive. This man seemed completely indifferent to who was listening. The piece the beggar played seemed to have no clear structure. It wasn't building toward a climax in any traditional sense. Instead, it flowed like water, sometimes rushing, sometimes still, always moving somewhere but never arriving. Marcus found himself trying to analyze it, to break it down into components he could understand and categorize. But every time he thought he had grasped something, the music shifted, and his understanding slipped away. Marcus looked down and realized his hands were shaking. Not from the cold. From something else entirely. Something that felt dangerously close to emotion, to vulnerability, to all the things he had spent years building walls against. He stepped back toward the street, suddenly needing to get away from this music and this strange man who played it. Marcus stood at the mouth of the alley for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. His rational mind was screaming at him to leave, to dismiss this as street noise and go home to his safe, controlled world. But his feet wouldn't move. The music held him there like invisible chains, gentle but unbreakable. The beggar finished whatever piece he had been playing and lowered the instrument. He looked at Marcus again, this time with more attention. Marcus felt exposed under that gaze, like the old man could see through all his defenses, all his carefully constructed armor. It was deeply uncomfortable. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. He cleared his throat and asked where the man had learned to play like that. The beggar didn't answer immediately. He ran his rough fingers along the instrument's strings, not playing, just touching them gently. Then he said in a voice that sounded like gravel and honey mixed together that he hadn't learned it anywhere. It had learned him. The answer made no sense, and Marcus felt his irritation rising. He didn't like riddles or mystical nonsense. He dealt in facts, in technique, in measurable skill. He asked again, more forcefully this time, demanding to know where the man had studied, who his teachers were, what conservatory had trained him. These were the questions that mattered. Credentials. Pedigree. Proof. The beggar smiled at that, a sad knowing smile that made Marcus feel suddenly very young despite being 43 years old. The man said he had no teachers except silence and pain and time. He said he had learned his music in places Marcus wouldn't want to visit, in moments Marcus would never want to experience. His voice held no bitterness when he said this, just simple truth. Marcus felt anger bubbling up inside him. This was exactly the kind of pretentious artistic nonsense he hated. Real musicians had training. They had discipline. They practiced scales for hours. They studied theory and composition. They didn't just mystically channel music from the universe or whatever this charlatan was suggesting. He was about to say all this, about to unleash the famous Marcus Holloway fury that had made grown men cry. But then the beggar started playing again, and all the words died in Marcus's throat. This time the music was different, more intense, more personal. It felt like the old man was playing Marcus's own life story, the parts he never talked about. The dreams he had given up. The woman he had loved and lost. The father who had told him he would never be good enough. The night he had smashed his piano with a hammer after his final failed audition. How could this stranger know these things? How could mere music carry such specific weight? Marcus felt his eyes burning, felt moisture gathering there for the first time in years. He blinked hard, refusing to cry, especially not here in a dirty alley in front of some homeless musician. But the music kept coming, kept pulling at things deep inside him that he had locked away. The beggar's hands moved faster now, and the instrument sang with a voice that was almost human. Almost but not quite. There was something otherworldly about the sound, something that existed just beyond the edge of normal perception. Marcus thought he could hear harmonics that shouldn't exist, frequencies that human instruments couldn't produce. It was beautiful and terrible and completely impossible. Marcus realized he had moved closer without meaning to. He was now just a few feet from the beggar, standing in a puddle that soaked through his expensive shoes. He didn't care. Nothing mattered except the music. When the beggar finally stopped playing, the silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. Marcus stood there trembling, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered. The rain had picked up again, falling harder now, but neither man moved. Water ran down Marcus's face, mixing with tears he couldn't hide anymore. The beggar set his instrument down carefully on the crate beside him. He looked at Marcus with those strange amber eyes and asked if he was all right. The question was so simple, so genuine, that it broke something inside Marcus. When was the last time anyone had asked him that and actually wanted to know the answer? When was the last time he had been honest enough to give one? Marcus heard himself speaking, words tumbling out that he hadn't planned to say. He told this stranger that he didn't know what music was anymore. He had spent 20 years writing about it, teaching others about it, judging everyone else's attempts at it. But standing here listening to whatever the beggar had just played, Marcus realized he had forgotten what music actually was. He had turned it into something dead and academic, something to be dissected rather than experienced. The beggar listened without interrupting, his weathered face showing neither judgment nor pity. When Marcus finally ran out of words, the old man nodded slowly. He said that music wasn't something you could hold in your hands or trap in your mind. It was like trying to grab smoke or contain wind. The moment you thought you understood it completely, it slipped away and became something else. Marcus wanted to argue, to defend his life's work, to explain that there were rules and structures that mattered. But he couldn't. Every argument he tried to form in his mind sounded hollow even to himself. The beggar wasn't attacking him or his criticism. He was simply stating a truth that Marcus had once known but had forgotten, or maybe chosen to forget because it was easier to build walls than to remain vulnerable. The old man picked up his instrument again and offered it to Marcus. He told him to try playing something, anything at all. Marcus stepped back instinctively, his hands rising in refusal. He hadn't touched an instrument in over a decade. He had deliberately destroyed that part of himself. The thought of trying to play now, especially after hearing what the beggar could do, filled him with a terror he couldn't quite explain. But the beggar kept holding the instrument out, his expression patient and kind. He said that Marcus didn't have to play well or play anything recognizable. He just had to play honestly. That was all. Just let whatever was inside him come out through the strings. No judgment. No criticism. No expectations. Just sound and feeling and truth. Marcus felt his hands moving before his brain fully agreed. He took the instrument, and the moment his fingers touched it, something electric ran through him. The wood was warm despite the cold night, and it seemed to vibrate slightly, as if it contained its own life force. The weight of it felt both familiar and foreign. It had been so long. He lifted the bow with his other hand, his fingers remembering positions they shouldn't remember after all these years. The beggar stepped back, giving him space. Marcus stood alone in the alley, rain falling around him, holding this strange instrument that didn't quite feel like any violin he had played before. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Marcus closed his eyes and touched the bow to the strings. The first note that came out was rough and uncertain, nothing like the beggar's fluid mastery. It cracked and wavered. It was, by any objective standard, quite bad. Marcus felt shame rising in his chest, the same shame that had driven him away from music in the first place. But then he remembered what the beggar had said about honesty, and he kept playing. The sounds that came from the instrument were broken and clumsy at first. Marcus's fingers stumbled over notes, his rhythm was inconsistent, and his tone was thin. Everything he had spent years criticizing in others was present in his own playing. Part of him wanted to stop, to hand the instrument back and walk away. But something deeper kept him going. As he played, something strange began to happen. The music started to change, not in technical skill but in quality. It became more raw, more real. Marcus stopped trying to remember how things were supposed to sound and just let his fingers move where they wanted to go. The melody that emerged was sad and beautiful in its brokenness. It was the sound of a man who had lost something precious and was only now beginning to realize what it was. The beggar stood watching, his face illuminated by the weak streetlight. He wasn't smiling or frowning. He was simply present, bearing witness to whatever Marcus was releasing into the cold night air. There was something profoundly respectful in his silence, in the way he gave Marcus complete space to be imperfect and struggling and human. Marcus played for maybe 5 minutes, though time seemed to have stopped meaning anything. When he finally lowered the bow, his arms were shaking from effort and emotion. He handed the instrument back to the beggar, unable to meet the old man's eyes. He felt stripped bare, more exposed than he had ever been in his life. All his defenses were gone. All his pretense had crumbled. The beggar took the instrument gently and said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. He said that what Marcus had just played was more honest than 99% of the music performed in fancy concert halls. It wasn't technically perfect, but it was true. And truth was always more important than perfection. Truth was what made music matter. Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, like a dam that had been holding back a flood for too many years. He stood there in the rain and cried properly this time, not trying to hide it or fight it. The beggar didn't look away or try to comfort him with empty words. He just let Marcus be, understanding that sometimes people needed to fall apart before they could start putting themselves back together. After a while, Marcus managed to compose himself enough to speak. He asked the beggar his name. The old man hesitated for a moment, then said his name was Samuel. No last name, just Samuel. He had left his last name behind a long time ago, along with everything else from his previous life. All that remained was the music and the road and the endless movement from place to place. Marcus wanted to ask more questions. Where had Samuel come from? How long had he been living on the streets? What had brought him to this life? But something in the old man's expression told him these questions would go unanswered. Samuel's past was his own, and he had no intention of sharing it. That was fair. Marcus had his own secrets, his own painful history he didn't like to discuss. Instead, Marcus asked if he could come back tomorrow. He didn't know why he asked. He had a prestigious job, important lectures to give, articles to write for major publications. He shouldn't be wasting time with a homeless musician in a back alley. But he needed to come back. Something essential was happening here, something that felt more important than anything else in his carefully organized life. Samuel nodded slowly. He would be here, he said. He was always here in the evenings after the shops closed and the streets emptied. Anyone who truly wanted to find him could find him. The question was always whether they were brave enough to listen to what his music might tell them about themselves. Marcus walked home that night in a daze. His expensive apartment felt especially empty when he opened the door. The space was immaculate, everything in its place, sterile as a museum. Awards lined the walls. Bookshelves held hundreds of volumes about music theory, composer biographies, and collections of his own published criticisms. But nothing living. Nothing that breathed or grew or changed. He stood in his kitchen and realized he couldn't remember the last time he had cooked a real meal. Couldn't remember the last time he had invited anyone over. Couldn't remember the last time he had laughed or felt surprised or experienced wonder. His life had become a series of predictable routines, each day bleeding into the next with nothing to distinguish one from another. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time Marcus closed his eyes, he heard Samuel's music playing in his head. The melodies shifted and changed in his memory, never quite the same twice. And underneath it all, he kept remembering the feeling of holding that instrument, of making sounds that were imperfect but real. It had terrified him. It had also felt like coming home after a very long absence. The next morning, Marcus went through his usual routine. Coffee. Shower. Expensive suit. But his heart wasn't in it. He had a meeting scheduled with the editor of a major music magazine to discuss his next series of articles. They wanted him to attend the upcoming winter concert series and write scathing reviews that would generate controversy and sell subscriptions. It was what he always did. It was what he was good at. But sitting in the editor's modern office, surrounded by framed magazine covers and industry awards, Marcus found he couldn't focus. The editor was talking about which young musicians they should target, which established artists were getting too comfortable and needed to be taken down a notch. These conversations had always energized Marcus before. Today they made him feel sick. He heard himself saying he needed some time off. The words surprised him as much as they surprised the editor. He hadn't planned to say that. But once the words were out, he couldn't take them back. The editor's face went through several expressions, landing on concerned confusion. Time off? Marcus Holloway never took time off. He was the most productive critic in the industry. What was going on? Marcus made up something about fatigue, about needing to recharge his creative batteries. The editor reluctantly agreed to give him 2 weeks, though his expression suggested he thought Marcus was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe he was. Marcus didn't care. He just needed space to think, to figure out what was happening to him. He left the office and walked aimlessly through the city. Prague was beautiful in the weak winter sunlight. He had lived here for 8 years and had stopped seeing it somewhere along the way. Now he noticed details he had missed before. Street performers on corners. Children laughing in parks. Old women feeding pigeons. Life happening everywhere while he had been sealed inside his bubble of criticism and judgment. That evening, Marcus found himself back in the alley before he consciously decided to go there. Samuel was already there, sitting on his crate, tuning his instrument. He looked up when Marcus approached and nodded as if he had known Marcus would return. There was no surprise in his expression, no smugness either. Just simple acknowledgement. Marcus had brought something with him. A thermos of hot soup from a restaurant near his apartment and a thick wool blanket he had grabbed from his closet. He offered them to Samuel awkwardly, not sure how the gesture would be received. He had never given anything to a homeless person before. He had always walked past them quickly, uncomfortable with their existence, with the reminder that life could be so precarious. Samuel accepted the soup and blanket with quiet gratitude. He didn't make a big production of thanking Marcus, didn't grovel or bless him or any of the things Marcus had half expected. He simply acknowledged the kindness and set the items carefully beside him. Then he gestured for Marcus to sit on another crate that appeared to have materialized from somewhere in the shadows. They sat in silence for a while as Samuel drank the soup. Marcus realized he had no idea what to say. He was used to dominating conversations, lecturing, pronouncing judgment. But here in this alley with this strange old man, all his usual strategies felt wrong. So he just sat and waited, learning the shape of silence. Finally, Samuel spoke. He asked Marcus what he was running from. The question was so direct, so unexpected, that Marcus almost laughed. But the laugh died in his throat because he knew the answer. He was running from the person he could have been. From the musician he had wanted to become before fear and perfectionism and 1,000 small failures had convinced him to give up. Marcus found himself telling Samuel the whole story. About his childhood as a piano prodigy. About his domineering father who was never satisfied with anything less than absolute perfection. About the prestigious music academy that had accepted him, where he had studied under masters who slowly crushed his spirit with their endless criticism and impossible standards. About the woman he had loved who had left him because he could no longer feel anything, could no longer be vulnerable or real. Samuel listened without interrupting, his weathered face reflecting the streetlight's glow. When Marcus finished, the old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that cut straight through to the heart of things. He said that Marcus had made a choice years ago to become someone who destroyed rather than created because destroying felt safer. It required no vulnerability, no risk, no possibility of failure because he was never actually trying to succeed at anything. The words should have made Marcus angry. They should have triggered his defenses, his justifications, all the reasons why his life was perfectly valid and important. But instead, he felt a strange sense of relief. Someone had finally said out loud what he had known but refused to acknowledge. The truth hurt, but it was clean pain, honest pain. Better than the dull ache of denial he had carried for so long. Samuel picked up his instrument and began to play again. This time the music was gentler, more hopeful. It sounded like spring after a long winter, like dawn breaking after endless night. Marcus closed his eyes and let it wash over him. He didn't try to analyze it or understand it. He just experienced it, purely and completely, the way a child might. When Samuel finished, Marcus asked him to teach him. Not technique or theory. Those things Marcus already knew. He wanted Samuel to teach him whatever it was that made the old man's music feel so alive, so real, so impossibly present. He was willing to pay whatever it cost. Money was no object. But Samuel shook his head. He couldn't teach what Marcus wanted to learn because it wasn't something that could be taught. It could only be discovered, and each person had to discover it in their own way, through their own pain and joy and struggle. What Samuel could offer was companionship on that journey. He could play his music and share his presence and be a mirror that reflected truth back when Marcus was ready to see it. Marcus felt disappointed at first, but then he understood. He had spent his whole life looking for shortcuts, for formulas, for someone to give him the secret that would make everything easy. But there were no shortcuts. The path to real music, to real anything, required walking through fire. Required facing all the things he had been avoiding. Required becoming vulnerable in ways that terrified him. He asked if he could just sit here sometimes and listen. Samuel smiled at that, a genuine warm smile that transformed his weathered face into something almost beautiful. Of course, he said. The alley was open to anyone. The music belonged to whoever had ears to hear it. Marcus was welcome anytime. Over the following days, Marcus returned to the alley every evening. He started arriving earlier each time, helping Samuel set up his makeshift performance space. They didn't talk much. Sometimes they sat in companionable silence. Other times Samuel would play for hours while Marcus listened, learning to hear music in a completely different way than he had been taught. Marcus began to notice things he had missed his entire life. The way Samuel breathed between phrases, making the instrument an extension of his own body. The way certain notes lingered in the air longer than physics should allow. The way the music seemed to respond to the environment, becoming quieter when cars passed, swelling when the wind picked up, adapting to the moment rather than following some predetermined structure. One evening, a young woman stopped at the mouth of the alley. She stood there listening, tears streaming down her face. When Samuel finished playing, she approached and thanked him, saying his music had helped her make a difficult decision about her life. She placed a few coins in an old hat Samuel kept on the ground and walked away looking lighter somehow, as if she had set down a heavy burden. Marcus asked Samuel if that happened often. The old man nodded. He said music had power when it came from a true place. Not power to control or manipulate, but power to touch something essential in people, to remind them they weren't alone, to help them feel whatever they needed to feel. That was the real purpose of music. Not to impress or entertain, but to connect and heal and illuminate. This perspective shook everything Marcus thought he knew about his profession. He had spent years judging music by technical standards, by how closely it adhered to established rules, by whether it displayed proper training and discipline. But he had completely missed the point. Music wasn't about rules. It was about truth and connection and the mysterious way sound could bypass the thinking mind and speak directly to the soul. Marcus started carrying a small notebook with him to the alley. But instead of writing critical observations, he wrote about what he felt when he listened. Descriptions of emotions he had forgotten he could feel. Questions about his own life and choices. Memories from childhood that Samuel's music seemed to unlock. The notebook became a kind of diary, a record of his inner transformation. One night, Samuel asked Marcus to play again. This time Marcus felt less afraid. He took the instrument and closed his eyes, not thinking about technique or judgment, just feeling. The music that emerged was still imperfect, still rough around the edges, but it was more confident than before. More honest. Marcus played his confusion and his fear and his slowly growing hope that maybe his life could be different. When he finished, Samuel told him something important. He said that Marcus's critical voice, the one that had dominated his life for so long, was actually trying to protect him. It had developed as a defense mechanism when he was young and vulnerable. But defenses that once served a purpose could become prisons. The work now was to thank that critical voice for trying to keep him safe, and then gently set it aside so his authentic self could emerge. The idea seemed too simple to be profound, but Marcus felt its truth in his bones. His inner critic wasn't his enemy. It was a frightened part of himself that had been doing its best to prevent more pain. But in protecting him from failure, it had also protected him from growth, from joy, from real connection with music and with life itself. He needed to find a new way forward that honored his past while not being trapped by it. That night, Marcus went home and did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He sat down at his dusty piano, the one he had kept covered in his spare room like a corpse he couldn't quite bury. He lifted the cover and looked at the keys. Some were yellowed with age. The piano was probably out of tune. But that didn't matter. He placed his hands on the keys and played. The sounds that came from Marcus's piano that night were terrible by any conventional standard. His fingers were stiff, his timing was off, and the out-of-tune keys created dissonance that would make any trained musician wince. But Marcus didn't stop. He played through the awkwardness, through the frustration, through the voice in his head that told him he was embarrassing himself even though no one was listening. He played for 2 hours straight, his fingers gradually remembering patterns they had practiced thousands of times as a young man. Muscle memory was a strange thing. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget. As he played, emotions surfaced that he had buried so deep he thought they were gone forever. Anger at his father. Grief for his lost dreams. Loneliness from all the years he had pushed people away. But also something lighter. Curiosity. Wonder. A tentative joy that felt fragile as a soap bubble. When he finally stopped, his hands were shaking and his face was wet with tears again. He seemed to be crying a lot lately. But these tears felt different from the bitter ones he used to shed in private. These were cleansing somehow, like rain washing away years of accumulated dust. He sat at the piano bench for a long time, just breathing, just being present with himself in a way he rarely allowed. The next morning, Marcus did something that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He called in sick to his regular column deadline. Then he called the university and cancelled his scheduled lectures for the rest of the month. His colleagues and students would be shocked. Marcus Holloway never cancelled anything. He was reliability itself, the one constant in an unpredictable industry. But he needed this time. He needed space to figure out who he was beyond the roles he had been playing. He spent the day walking through Prague, really seeing the city for the first time in years. He visited museums he had always been too busy for. He sat in cafes and watched people, imagining their stories. He went to a park and listened to a street violinist play Bach, and instead of mentally cataloging all the technical errors, he simply enjoyed the moment. The young musician looked happy, totally absorbed in the music. When had Marcus last felt that way about anything? That evening in the alley, Samuel seemed to sense something had shifted in Marcus. The old man played with particular intensity, as if celebrating Marcus's small steps forward. Between songs, Samuel told him about his own journey. Not the details Marcus had wanted to know earlier, but something more important. He talked about how he had once been consumed by ambition, by the need to be recognized and celebrated. That ambition had destroyed relationships, health, peace of mind. He had lost everything chasing fame and recognition. And in that loss, In that complete dissolution of the life he thought he wanted, he had finally found what actually mattered. He found that music itself was enough. Not music as a vehicle for ego or career, but music as a practice of presence, as a way of being fully alive in each moment. The instrument became his teacher, and the streets became his conservatory. Every person who stopped to listen became his audience and also his reminder of why music existed in the first place. Marcus listened to this story and felt something shift inside him. He had been so focused on what he had lost, on the life he didn't get to have, that he had never considered what he might gain. Maybe his failure to become a concert pianist wasn't the tragedy he had made it out to be. Maybe it was an opportunity to discover a different relationship with music, one based on truth rather than achievement. He asked Samuel if he ever missed his old life, whatever it had been. Samuel thought about this carefully before answering. He said there were moments, especially in harsh winter or when illness came, when the comfort and security of conventional life seemed appealing. But then he would pick up his instrument and play, and he would remember why he had chosen this path. Freedom. Authenticity. The ability to be fully himself without compromise. Those things were worth any discomfort. Marcus realized he had been living a comfortable life that made him miserable. He had security and recognition and money. But he had no freedom. No authenticity. No real connection to the thing he supposedly loved. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, too afraid to risk anything by trying to break free. Word began to spread about the mysterious musician in the alley. Other people started showing up in the evenings, drawn by rumors of something extraordinary happening in that forgotten corner of the city. They came curious and skeptical, and many left changed in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Samuel never acknowledged the growing audience. He played as he always played, for the music itself, not for applause or recognition. Marcus watched this happen with mixed feelings. Part of him wanted to protect this sacred space, to keep it private and special. But another part understood that Samuel's music belonged to everyone who needed it. It was selfish to want to keep it for himself. Still, he felt a sense of loss as the intimate evenings he had shared with Samuel became more crowded and public. One night, a music journalist Marcus knew appeared at the alley. She was young and ambitious, always looking for the next big story. She had her phone out, recording Samuel's playing, probably planning to write an article about the undiscovered genius living on the streets. Marcus felt protective anger rise in him. This wasn't some story to be packaged and sold. This was a human being's life, a sacred practice that existed outside the machinery of the music industry. After Samuel finished playing, Marcus pulled the journalist aside. He asked her not to write about Samuel, not to turn this into content for consumption. She looked at him like he had gone crazy. "This was news," she said. "People deserve to know about this incredible talent. Besides, exposure would help Samuel. He could get off the streets, get proper representation, maybe even record an album. Wouldn't that be better for everyone?" Marcus tried to explain that Samuel didn't want those things, that he had chosen this life deliberately, that exposure would ruin what made his music special. But the journalist didn't understand. She saw only wasted potential, a feel-good story waiting to be told. She left the alley with her recording, and Marcus knew she would write her article regardless of what he said. The modern world didn't know how to leave sacred things alone. He apologized to Samuel for the journalist's intrusion. But the old man just shrugged philosophically. He said that whatever was meant to happen would happen. He couldn't control how others responded to his music or what they did with it. All he could control was his own intention, his own practice, his own relationship with the sound he created. If fame came and disrupted his life again, he would deal with it then. Worrying about it now served no purpose. This attitude fascinated Marcus. Samuel lived with a level of surrender and acceptance that Marcus had never achieved. Marcus was always trying to control outcomes, to manage perceptions, to ensure specific results. The idea of just letting life unfold without grasping or pushing seemed impossibly naive. And yet Samuel radiated a peace that Marcus desperately wanted but didn't know how to find. That week, the article appeared in a major music publication. It was exactly what Marcus had feared. The journalist had written a sensationalized piece about the homeless virtuoso playing otherworldly music in a Prague alley. She had included Samuel's location and times when he usually played. She had compared him to legendary musicians and speculated about his mysterious past. The article went viral, shared thousands of times across social media. Within days, the alley was crowded every evening. Hundreds of people showed up with cameras and phones, treating Samuel like a tourist attraction. They talked loudly during his performances, interrupted him for selfies, offered money in exchange for private concerts. The sacred space had been destroyed, turned into a circus. Samuel continued playing, but Marcus could see the toll it was taking. The music became less fluid, less transcendent. How could anyone access deep truth surrounded by chaos and demand? Marcus felt responsible for this disaster. If he had confronted the journalist more forcefully, if he had physically stopped her from recording, maybe this wouldn't have happened. He apologized to Samuel again, more urgently this time. But Samuel's response surprised him. The old man said that this too was part of the journey. Every gain brought loss. Every opening brought closing. The music had touched many people through that article, had reached those who needed it. That was good. The cost was the loss of privacy and peace. That was the price. Nothing was free in this life. The crowds grew worse each night. Music promoters appeared, offering Samuel contracts and recording deals. Wealthy patrons wanted to sponsor him, to move him into an apartment, to turn him into their personal project. Everyone wanted something from him. Everyone had plans for how he should live his life. The noise and chaos made it impossible for Samuel to play the way he used to play. After a particularly difficult evening where someone had tried to steal Samuel's instrument for resale online, Marcus made a decision. He asked Samuel if he would consider disappearing for a while, going somewhere quieter where he could play in peace again. Marcus offered to help however he could. Money for travel, a place to stay, whatever Samuel needed. The offer came from genuine care, not from any desire to control or possess. Samuel considered this carefully. He admitted the situation had become untenable. His music required stillness and space, neither of which were possible anymore in the alley. But he had no desire to hide in some comfortable apartment, cut off from the world. He was a street musician. The streets were his home and his stage. He just needed different streets, at least for now. They made a plan. Marcus would drive Samuel to a small mountain town several hours away, a place Marcus knew from childhood visits to his grandmother. It was quiet there, mostly locals, not many tourists. Samuel could play in the town square or on the bridge over the river. He could rebuild the practice that had been disrupted. And when things calmed down in Prague, if they ever did, he could decide whether to return. The night before they left, Marcus went back to the alley one last time. The crowds had thinned a bit, the novelty wearing off for those who had just been curious. But there were still enough people to make genuine music impossible. Samuel played a short piece and then packed up his instrument. He nodded to Marcus, and they walked together to where Marcus had parked his car several blocks away. The drive through the dark countryside was quiet at first. Marcus didn't know what to say. He was helping Samuel escape a problem that Marcus himself had partly caused by not stopping that journalist more effectively. But Samuel seemed to hold no resentment. He sat in the passenger seat looking out at the passing landscape, his instrument case held carefully on his lap, his expression peaceful despite everything. Halfway through the journey, Samuel spoke. He thanked Marcus for his help and his friendship. He said that Marcus had changed too over these past weeks, had softened and opened in ways that gave Samuel hope. The world needed more people willing to question their certainties, to let themselves be transformed by experiences that challenged their assumptions. Marcus had done that, and Samuel was grateful to have witnessed it. Marcus felt emotion rise in his throat. He realized he would miss these evening sessions with Samuel, miss the way the old man's music had become the anchor point of his days. Everything else in his life felt uncertain now. He had taken a leave of absence from his criticism work. He had started declining speaking engagements and interviews. He was spending hours at his piano each day, playing not to achieve anything but simply to play. His whole identity was in flux. They arrived in the mountain town just as dawn was breaking. The place looked exactly as Marcus remembered from childhood. Small stone buildings clustered around a town square. A church with a bell tower. A river running cold and clear from the mountains. Everything quiet and slow and real. Samuel smiled when he saw it, the first real smile Marcus had seen on his face in days. Marcus had arranged for Samuel to stay in a small room above a bakery whose owner owed Marcus's grandmother an old favor. It wasn't much, just a bed and a small stove, but it was warm and safe. Samuel accepted it gratefully, though Marcus suspected he wouldn't use it much. The old man was happiest outside, under the sky, part of the world rather than separated from it. Before Marcus left to drive back to Prague, Samuel gave him something. It was a small wooden pendant carved in an intricate pattern that Marcus couldn't quite follow with his eyes. Samuel said he had made it years ago and had been waiting for the right person to give it to. He told Marcus to wear it as a reminder that music wasn't something separate from life. It was life itself, the vibration that moved through everything. Every moment could be music if you had ears to hear it properly. Marcus drove back to Prague with the pendant hanging around his neck. The journey gave him time to think about everything that had happened. A month ago, he had been a different person entirely. Closed off, bitter, using his intellect as a weapon against a world that had disappointed him. Now he felt raw and open and uncertain about everything. But the uncertainty didn't terrify him the way it once would have. It felt more like possibility. When he returned to his apartment, he looked at it with fresh eyes. The awards on the walls meant nothing to him anymore. The published books of his criticism seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. The whole space felt like a museum dedicated to a person who no longer existed. He spent the weekend boxing up things he didn't need anymore. Not throwing them away, but putting them in storage. Creating space for whoever he was becoming. Monday morning, Marcus received a call from his editor. The magazine had been trying to reach him all week. They were concerned about his extended absence and wanted to know when he would be returning to work. There was a major concert series starting soon that needed his coverage. Important advertisers were asking specifically for his reviews. His presence mattered to the publication's credibility and success. Marcus listened to all of this and felt nothing. The urgency that used to drive him was simply gone. He told the editor he wouldn't be returning, not to that particular work anyway. He was resigning his position effective immediately. The editor's response was a mixture of shock and anger. Did Marcus understand what he was throwing away? His reputation, his influence, his income? This was career suicide. No one walked away from the kind of position Marcus held. But Marcus had already made his decision. He thanked the editor for years of employment and hung up before the conversation could turn ugly. His hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear. From relief. He had just closed a door that had needed closing for a very long time. Whatever came next was unknown, but it had to be better than slowly dying inside while pretending everything was fine. Over the following weeks, Marcus's life changed dramatically. Without his column and lectures, his income disappeared. He had savings, but they wouldn't last forever. He needed to figure out what came next. But instead of panicking or immediately searching for similar work, he let himself just be for a while. He played piano every day. He took long walks. He visited galleries and attended concerts not to judge them but to experience them. Something interesting started happening. The concerts he attended as an anonymous audience member rather than as a famous critic felt completely different. He noticed details he had missed before. The way musicians glanced at each other, communicating in a language beyond words. The collective breath-holding of an audience during a particularly beautiful passage. The imperfect moments that somehow made the performance more human and touching. He started writing again, but not criticism. He wrote about his own relationship with music, about what he was learning and unlearning. He wrote about Samuel and the transformative power of honest artistic expression. He wrote without knowing if anyone would read it or care, writing simply because the words needed to come out. The process felt completely different from his old work. Less calculating. More vulnerable. More true. One evening, Marcus attended a performance by a young cellist at a small venue. The performer was clearly nervous, made several technical mistakes, and at one point actually stopped and apologized to the audience before starting over. The old Marcus would have written a savage review, using the performance as an example of declining standards and insufficient preparation. But this Marcus saw something else. He saw courage. He saw someone willing to be imperfect in public, to risk failure in pursuit of something beautiful. After the concert, Marcus did something he had never done before. He approached the young musician backstage and told her that her performance had moved him. Not because it was technically perfect, but because it was brave and honest. The cellist looked at him with surprise and gratitude, clearly expecting criticism. She thanked him, and they talked for a few minutes about music and fear and the pressure to be perfect. When Marcus left, he felt he had given something valuable rather than taking something away through harsh judgment. Marcus began receiving messages from former colleagues and students asking what had happened to him. Some expressed concern for his mental health. Others were angry that he had abandoned his responsibilities. A few admitted they were inspired by his choice to walk away from a career that was making him miserable. The responses varied wildly, showing him how many different relationships people had with their own work and lives. One message particularly stood out. It was from a young composer whose career Marcus had nearly destroyed 5 years earlier with a brutal review. The composer wrote that while the review had devastated him at the time, it had also forced him to examine why he was making music in the first place. Eventually, he had stopped trying to please critics and started creating from a more authentic place. His new work was better, truer, and he was happier. He thanked Marcus in a strange way for the painful push that had led to growth. Marcus didn't know how to feel about this. He was glad the composer had found his way, but he also recognized that his cruel review could just as easily have destroyed the young man permanently. How many others had he damaged who hadn't been strong enough to recover? How many potential artists had he driven away from music altogether? The weight of these questions sat heavy on his heart. He decided to do something about it. Marcus began writing personal letters to every young musician he could remember tearing down in his reviews over the years. The letters were apologies, but not simple ones. He explained his own journey, his own pain and fear that had driven him to lash out at others. He took responsibility for his cruelty while acknowledging that they had survived despite him. Some recipients never responded. A few wrote back with forgiveness. Others with continued anger that Marcus understood and accepted. During this time, Marcus maintained regular phone contact with Samuel. The old man had settled into life in the mountain town beautifully. He played in the town square most evenings, and the locals had adopted him as one of their own. They brought him food, invited him to dinners, looked after him in the gentle way small communities sometimes do. His music had become part of the town's daily rhythm, a gift that people appreciated without trying to possess or exploit. Samuel asked Marcus how he was doing, and Marcus found himself being completely honest. He talked about the uncertainty, the financial pressure, the fear that he had made a terrible mistake. But he also talked about the joy of playing piano without judgment, the peace of morning walks, the strange lightness of having nothing to prove to anyone. Samuel listened and then told him something important. He said that the void between old life and new life was the most sacred space. It was where transformation actually happened, where the old self died and the new self was born. Marcus thought about this idea constantly. He was in the void, suspended between who he had been and who he might become. It was uncomfortable and frightening, but Samuel was right. Something essential was happening in this empty space. He was learning to be comfortable with not knowing, with not having all the answers, with being uncertain and still okay. Money eventually became a real concern. Marcus's savings were dwindling, and he needed some form of income. But he had no interest in returning to criticism, and he wasn't skilled at much else. He had spent his entire adult life evaluating other people's music rather than creating anything himself. What could he possibly offer the world now? The answer came from an unexpected place. A small community music school contacted him, having heard through the grapevine about his resignation and subsequent soul-searching. They were looking for someone to teach adult beginners, people who had always wanted to learn music but had been too afraid or too busy. The pay was minimal, barely enough to cover rent and basic expenses. But something about the opportunity called to Marcus. He met with the school director, a warm woman in her 60s who had been teaching music her whole life. She asked Marcus directly about his reputation as a harsh critic. Could he work with beginners without crushing their spirits? Marcus was honest. He told her about his journey with Samuel, about what he was learning about music and vulnerability and the purpose of artistic expression. He said he couldn't promise to be perfect, but he could promise to try being kind. The director smiled at that. She said perfection wasn't what they needed. They needed someone who understood both the technical side of music and the emotional courage it took to start learning as an adult. Someone who had experienced both success and failure, pride and humility. Marcus started the next week. Teaching adult beginners was harder than Marcus expected, but not in the ways he had anticipated. The technical instruction was straightforward. But watching grown men and women struggle with simple scales, seeing their frustration and embarrassment at being bad at something, triggered all of Marcus's own memories of inadequacy and failure. He had to consciously fight the urge to correct them harshly, to point out every error, to demand perfection they weren't capable of yet. Instead, he tried to teach the way he wished he had been taught. With patience. With encouragement. With acknowledgement that learning anything new required being willing to be terrible at it first. He praised small improvements. He shared his own mistakes and struggles. He created a space where it was safe to fail, to sound bad, to be imperfect and still worthy of respect and encouragement. Something unexpected happened. His students started to flourish in ways that surprised everyone, including Marcus. A 60-year-old accountant who had never touched a piano began playing simple pieces with genuine feeling. A young mother who was convinced she had no musical talent discovered she could lose herself completely in the act of playing. A retired soldier with shaking hands found that music helped quiet the demons from his past. They weren't becoming virtuosos, but they were becoming more fully themselves through the act of making sound. Marcus found this work far more fulfilling than anything he had done as a critic. These people weren't seeking fame or recognition. They just wanted to experience the joy of creation, to add beauty to their lives, to connect with something larger than their daily routines. In helping them, Marcus was helping himself. He was learning that music's value had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with presence and authenticity. One day, Marcus received a call from the mountain town. Samuel had collapsed while playing in the town square. The doctors said it was his heart, weakened from years of hard living on the streets. He was in the hospital, stable but fragile. Marcus immediately got in his car and drove through the night to reach him. He couldn't bear the thought of Samuel facing this alone, even though he knew the old man had faced harder things than illness in his long life. At the hospital, Marcus found Samuel in a small room, looking smaller somehow in the white bed with machines beeping around him. But his eyes were clear and calm when he saw Marcus. He smiled and made a joke about finally getting a proper bed to sleep in, even if it took nearly dying to get one. Marcus sat beside him and took his weathered hand, not knowing what to say. Samuel told Marcus not to look so worried. He had lived a full life, longer than he probably deserved. He had made music until the very end, which was all he had ever wanted. If this was his time to go, he was ready. But he also said there was still work to do, music still to play, and maybe the universe wasn't done with him yet. He would let his body decide and trust whatever happened. They talked through the afternoon and into the evening. Samuel wanted to hear about Marcus's teaching work, about his students and their progress. He listened with genuine interest as Marcus described the 60-year-old accountant's first complete piece, the young mother's breakthrough moment, the soldier's gradual healing. Samuel said this was important work, maybe more important than any concert performance or famous recording. These were real lives being touched and changed through music's power. Marcus asked Samuel about his own life, the parts he had never shared. Who had he been before becoming a street musician? What had happened to bring him to that alley in Prague where they had first met? Samuel considered these questions carefully. Then he began to tell his story, and Marcus listened with full attention, knowing these words were a gift not given lightly. Samuel had been a concert violinist once, quite famous in certain circles. He had played in major halls across Europe, recorded albums that critics praised, accumulated wealth and recognition. But success had poisoned him. He became arrogant, cruel, obsessed with his own importance. He destroyed relationships with everyone who loved him. He pushed away his wife and children in pursuit of greater fame. He betrayed friends and colleagues to advance his career. Then one night, at the peak of his success, his hands began to shake during a performance. The condition worsened rapidly. Within months, he could no longer play at the professional level his reputation demanded. His career collapsed. His so-called friends disappeared. His family, whom he had neglected for years, wanted nothing to do with him. He lost everything and found himself alone with nothing but an old violin and the recognition that he had wasted his life chasing illusions. Samuel continued his story in a quiet voice, the hospital room dim except for the small lamp beside the bed. He told Marcus how he had spent years wandering, living on the streets, drinking to forget. The shaking in his hands eventually improved enough that he could play again, but it was different now. The technical brilliance was gone, but something else had taken its place. A depth. A truth. Music had become prayer rather than performance, connection rather than competition. He had learned that the unattainable wasn't technical perfection or critical acclaim or any of the external markers of success he had chased for so long. The unattainable was the mystery at the heart of music itself, the way sound could carry meaning that words could never express, the way a few notes could crack open the human heart and let light flood in. He had touched it occasionally in that alley, in moments of complete presence when self disappeared and only music remained. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as Samuel spoke. The old man's story was his own story, just lived in a different order. Marcus had avoided the trap of success by never achieving it, but he had fallen into the same patterns of pride and cruelty and disconnection. They were mirrors for each other, showing different paths to the same essential lessons about what mattered and what didn't. Samuel squeezed Marcus's hand weakly. He said that Marcus's journey was just beginning. He had broken free from the prison of criticism, had started reconnecting with music and with his own humanity. But the real work was staying open, staying vulnerable, continuing to choose authenticity over safety day after day for the rest of his life. That was the true challenge, the one that never ended. Over the next few days, Samuel slowly recovered. His heart was damaged but still functioning. The doctors said he could leave the hospital but needed to rest, to avoid stress and exertion. Samuel listened politely and nodded, and Marcus knew the old man had no intention of following these instructions. The day Samuel was discharged, Marcus drove him back to the town square. Samuel picked up his instrument and played, ignoring the concerned looks from townspeople who thought he should be resting. Marcus had to return to Prague for his teaching responsibilities, but he promised to visit regularly. Before he left, Samuel gave him a final piece of advice. He told Marcus to write about what he had learned, not as criticism but as testimony. There were other people trapped in the same patterns Marcus had escaped, other souls who had forgotten why they loved music in the first place. They needed to hear his story. They needed to know that transformation was possible at any age, that it was never too late to choose a different path. Back in Prague, Marcus thought about Samuel's words. He began writing late at night after teaching, pouring out everything he had experienced and learned over the past months. The writing was raw and honest, nothing like his old polished criticism. He wrote about his own failures and fears. He wrote about Samuel and the transformative power of their encounter. He wrote about his students and what they were teaching him about courage and vulnerability. He sent the finished piece to a small arts magazine, not expecting much. But the editor loved it and published it immediately. The response was overwhelming. Marcus received hundreds of messages from people who recognized themselves in his story. Musicians who had lost their way. Critics who were tired of tearing others down. Anyone who had chosen safety over authenticity and was wondering if change was possible. His vulnerability had given others permission to be vulnerable too. More writing opportunities followed, but Marcus was selective about what he accepted. He only wrote about things he genuinely cared about, only praised work that moved him, only shared criticism when it was constructive and kind. His new work reached a smaller audience than his old reviews, but the impact was deeper. He was building people up rather than tearing them down, and the difference felt significant. His teaching work expanded. The community music school asked him to develop a program for at-risk youth, teenagers who were struggling and might benefit from creative expression. Marcus agreed, nervous but excited. These kids were tough, defensive, convinced the world had nothing good to offer them. They reminded Marcus of himself at that age, all sharp edges and hidden pain. The work was challenging. The teenagers tested him constantly, pushing boundaries, refusing to engage. But Marcus was patient. He shared his own story of failure and redemption. He let them see his imperfections, his continuing struggles. Slowly, walls began to come down. A few kids started actually trying, picking up instruments, making sounds that were terrible but real. And in those terrible sounds, Marcus heard possibility and hope and the beginning of transformation. Samuel called one evening with news. His heart was failing again, this time more seriously. The doctors said there was nothing more they could do. He had weeks, maybe days. He wanted Marcus to know so he could say goodbye properly. Marcus made the drive to the mountain town that same night, his heart heavy but also strangely at peace. Death was part of life. Samuel had taught him that. Everything ended, and that was okay. He found Samuel sitting by the river, his instrument beside him, watching the water flow past. The old man looked weak but serene. They sat together in silence for a long time, listening to the river's music, the wind in the trees, the distant sound of the town waking up to a new day. Finally, Samuel picked up his instrument and played one last time. The music was slow and gentle, like a lullaby, like a prayer, like a goodbye. When Samuel finished, he handed the instrument to Marcus. He said it was time for someone else to carry the music forward, to remember what really mattered, to keep touching the unattainable even though it could never be fully grasped. Marcus accepted the gift with trembling hands, knowing he could never play it the way Samuel had but also knowing that wasn't the point. The point was to try, to stay open, to keep making honest sound in a world that desperately needed it. Samuel died 3 days later, sitting in the town square, his face turned toward the sun. The townspeople found him peaceful and still, having slipped away between one breath and the next. They buried him in the small cemetery overlooking the river, and nearly everyone in town attended. Marcus played Samuel's instrument at the service, his hands shaking, his notes imperfect, but his heart completely present. It was the best playing he had ever done, not because of technical skill but because of love and gratitude and the truth Samuel had taught him about what music actually was. Marcus returned to Prague carrying Samuel's instrument and his lessons. He continued teaching, continued writing, continued learning to live with openness and vulnerability. Some days were easier than others. Old patterns sometimes resurface, old voices of criticism and judgment. But now Marcus had tools to work with them, to thank them for trying to protect him and then gently set them aside. Years passed. Marcus's reputation transformed from harsh critic to compassionate teacher and thoughtful writer. His students flourished. His articles reached people who needed them. His own playing improved not in technical brilliance but in emotional honesty. He never achieved the fame he had once craved, never became a renowned concert pianist. But he found something better. He found authenticity and connection and the daily practice of choosing truth over safety. Sometimes late at night, Marcus would sit with Samuel's instrument and play into the darkness. The music was never perfect, but it was real. And in those moments, he would remember the beggar in the alley, the man who had touched the unattainable with broken hands and shown Marcus that the only journey worth taking was the one toward becoming fully, imperfectly, courageously human.